Dan Severn, Minoru Suzuki, Baz Rutten, Fujita, Bob Sapp, Brock Lesnar, Bobby Lashley. These are all different names that we can mention when we're talking about pro wrestling and MMA. One side of the fans feel like us wrestling fans are weirdos. Why do we watch a fake sport? Wrestling fans look at MMA fans like, you guys are losers. But we're here to discuss one thing, knowledge. How did pro wrestling influence MMA?
Coming through.
It's your boy Delboy. I'm here with the OG knowledge. How you doing, bro?
What's cracking, Del?
Where do we start? I mean, I feel like the best place to start, the obvious place to start, Ali and Inoki.
That we could start there. I think we should go back even further.
Let's go. I mean, I personally would have started at probably like Bruce Lee, but
that's around the same time. That's around the same time.
But
yeah, bro. I mean, I personally would think we should go back even further. I think there's this thing.
Ricky Dozan?
We can go back to Ricky Dozan to an extent as well, but I think there's this disparity here between MMA and pro wrestling fans where I don't think either side realize the influence that both have on each other.
100%.
Especially the MMA side. I think MMA fans just see pro wrestling as being silly, and I think that they look at, you know, the athletes that come over, the pro wrestlers that come into MMA, and they really look down on them. But the truth is that pro wrestling helped create the mixed martial arts that we have today. And it was what we're going to talk about today. I mean, I think if you start, the person to start with is really Karl Gotch. And the reason I say Karl Gotch was the person to start with, I think Karl Gotch really is the godfather of mixed martial arts. I legit believe that. Yeah. But even if you want to go back further, I mean, there was a guy, 1877, there was a guy called John Graham Chambers. Okay. And he was the guy in Wales, he was British. And he created catch wrestling, can wrestling. Yeah. So what that was a mixture of all wrestling styles. And he created a new form. And what that basically meant was you could hold the waist and grapple from below the waist as well. So you could put moves on below the waist. Yeah. And he created that. And it became so popular. The name didn't last. It became catch wrestling after a while. Catch as catch can was a bit iffy. But what that started was that particular style of wrestling, they started doing that in carnivals. Yeah. And you would have, the carnivals would always back then have a thing where you'd have the strongmen and you could challenge the strongman to a fight. And if you beat him, you'd get however many shillings it was at the time or whatever. Anyway, these strongmen, which were wrestlers, catch wrestlers, they would really destroy the people in these towns. They would embarrass them. And word got around. So the townspeople would no longer, after a while, they wouldn't want to be involved in that. So they started putting plants in the audience, other catch wrestlers, and they would then come in and the strongmen / wrestlers would then do jobs, in theory, just to show the other people in the audience, you have a chance. You have a chance. Every few hours, they'd do a job. And then eventually, these wrestlers, they said, hey, if we have these fights in front of people, because they obviously would work real fights as well. Yeah. And they said, if we determine the outcomes of these, for one, we won't get injured.
Yeah, less injury.
We can have better matches. And also, they might even be a bit more exciting, and, you know, we could help draw something for the future. So that's where pro wrestling in its origin actually started. It started from real fights, eventually becoming fake
fights, yeah.
And, you know, eventually that really spread onto what we have today pretty much. There was guys called the Goldust Trio who really put in the aspects of pro wrestling that we know today, whether it be the ring ropes, bouncing off the ropes, heels and bad guys, the Goldust Trio, they invented all that stuff. And the reason why I say it starts with Karl Gotch is because Karl Gotch was really famous in the UK for being a really great catch and Greco-Roman wrestler. And he eventually went to America and he got blackballed because he broke Buddy Rogers' arm on purpose.
He was a world heavyweight champion.
He was an Olympian. Yeah. He was an Olympian. He never medaled, but he was an Olympian. He was a super tough guy. If you ever see Karl Gotch, even in his old days, he was an incredibly powerful looking guy. and he went to Japan because he was blackballed in the United States. He broke Buddy Rogers' arm, and his style was so legit, and it was so legit and authentic compared to what the Japanese were used to seeing, because Japanese wrestling at that time was very heavily influenced by America. You had the Sharp brothers, and Ricky Dozan was over there having pro matches, and then Karl Gotch comes in, and he's so legitimate, and he is so tough, and he's got these catch wrestling moves, these submission moves that no one had ever seen before. He became the god of pro wrestling, and that's the name, Karl Gotch, the god of pro wrestling. That is the person that people identify with the birth of that particular style. But the reason why I say we start with Karl Gotch, because his main students
was Inoki.
Antonio Inoki was one, and another one was Matsukatsu Funaki, Minoru Suzuki, Takada, and Satoru Siyama. Now, you go, those names are very important in the birth of mixed martial arts, right? For one, you mentioned Inoki and the Ali fight. What do you know about that fight?
From what I know, I do know it was meant to be a worked fight. I do know that Inoki was on the floor for most of the fight.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it.
You see the whole thing?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, not, I could.
You did.
I'll be real. It was. It didn't really intrigue me.
It's horrible.
There's better Inoki matches. Inoki, Barber. Yeah.
There's loads.
There's plenty of Inoki matches like what Inoki Flair, but this isn't about that. It's about MMA. But yeah, no, I didn't really enjoy the match.
Okay, so that fight. Just to get a bit of history on that fight. Obviously, I'm not going to go into who Muhammad Ali was. Antonio Inoki was, at the time, he was the biggest. The two big pro wrestling stars in Japan at the time were him and Giant Barber. Inoki was seen in Japan as being the toughest guy in Japan. And the reason why that was the case was because he booked himself in pro wrestling matches against real fighters, and they were purported to be real fights. He would fight guys from all over the world from different arts, and they would do massive TV numbers. He would fight judokas, he would fight karate men, he would fight sumo wrestlers, he would fight guys.
This is important you're saying this, by the way.
Oh, really?
This is really important that you're saying this.
So he had this rep for being a super tough guy, and people thought they were real. They were not real.
Especially the fact that he's fighting people from different types of martial arts.
Yes. This is going to go somewhere. So Ali, biggest name in boxing. Inoki, huge star in Japan. They offered Ali $2 million to have this fight. Ali agreed to it. It was supposed to be a worked fight. Ali agreed to do the work fight for $2 million. He got there and he thought about it, and he was like, I can't lose this fight. He says, I can't lose this fight. And they tried to get him to agree to do a job, and he couldn't do it. So the rules that you see in that match, and the reason you say that the match was horrible, it was awful. The rules for that match were laid out that day. All we knew is that Inoki couldn't suplex, and he couldn't karate chop, because they were stupid back then. They thought that he would go in there and do this to right? So all these people were like, he can't karate chop, you know, and he can't suplex, but he could kick, but he couldn't kick above the waist. So Inoki laid on his back, and he just kicked away at Ali's legs. Nowadays, if you watch the whole fight, leg kicks are super dangerous. And as you can see, the welts on Ali's legs throughout the fight, you can see them raise. And, you know, Ali, his mobility after that he was shot after that fight. That's pretty much the end of his career as a super fast fighter. Inoki really put damage on his legs. But
so technically he won. He won.
Score it with 2023 eyes, Antonio Inoki beat Muhammad Ali. I think Ali hit him twice. You know, over 15 rounds. 15 times, so it's 45 minutes in two shots. So,
and it's crazy you even say that, because if you even look at maybe someone like Minoru Suzuki, if you watch a lot of his fights in Pancrase, that seemed to be a bit of his kind of like his style, where he'd be fighting on his back and laying on his back, trying to be on the guard.
Okay.
Which was interesting.
Yeah.
But we'll get there.
We'll get there. But, so Ali, it was considered a draw, although people in Japan, we kind of saw that, you know, he won the fight. So that even made Inoki into a bigger deal. And he went into a different stratosphere at that time. And he formed New Japan Pro Wrestling in 81.
And Barber did All Japan.
Barber had All Japan, and Inoki had New Japan. Now, the story with New Japan, and it's really important, that the reason why New Japan is called the King of Sports is because Antonio Inoki used to beat all these guys from other sports. So that's why the king of sports term comes in. But going back to Karl Gotch, he trained Inoki, Funaki, Suzuki, Takada, and Satoru Siyama. And the reason why I bring these names up is because, for one, when Karl Gotch was training these guys, not only were they trained in pro wrestling, but they were also trained in real fighting as well. They were trained in catch wrestling. They were trained in Greco-Roman wrestling and many other martial arts as well. So Japanese wrestlers back then had a rep for being super tough men because they knew all of the... I mean, you learn submission moves from Karl Gotch. You know, I don't even know who... I don't know what you can compare that to, really. You know, so they were taught these arts and they were in pro wrestling. The problem was, though, is that a lot of these guys were so tough, a lot of them didn't want to do jobs. Yeah. You know, this Akira Maeda was one of... I should have mentioned him earlier on. Akira Maeda was one of Karl Gotch's students, and he hated doing jobs because he was tough and he knew he was the baddest guy on the planet, he felt. So why should he have to do jobs for this phony pro wrestler? Yeah. And that became a problem eventually. So then what happened is that these guys eventually split off and they started their own promotions. Yeah. So Tiger Mask, Satoru Siyama, he left in '86 and he formed a group called Shuto. And it was like a karate exhibition. Yeah. Have you ever seen Shuto? I've not seen Shuto. Okay, so it was guys. It's kind of like kick. Have you ever seen the kickboxer movie? Yeah. Guys in the ring and it was like that. You had Shuto, and then Akira Maeda. He had Rings. His promotion was called Rings. Yeah. Rings was it was purported to be real. It was supposed to be a real fighting organization. It was purported to be real. If you watch them, you can see that they weren't real at all. Yeah. And Funaki and Suzuki, they formed Pancras. Now, the thing I find interesting about this whole thing is that these guys left pro wrestling to be legit and start legit to start legit fighting organizations. The problem is, though, is that like the catch wrestlers did in 1877 when Chambers started catch, eventually they felt that you need to work these fights in order to create more exciting fights and to create interest in rematches. Yeah. So they felt you couldn't have real fights all the time. So if you watch Rings and Akira Maeda, you'll see that these fights were clearly worked. And Dave Meltzer once said that 70% of those matches before 2000 were not real. Yeah. There's a massive number. And if you look at the Pancras and Rings are very similar in that they were in wrestling rings and you could punch, kick, and do submission moves and stuff. But even if you look at Pancras and the style that they have, you can see a lot of those fights weren't real as well. Yeah. You know, you watch that stuff. Suzuki, Funaki, Shamrock. Yeah. A lot of that stuff was worked. Yeah, they were. And I mean, back then people were very quiet on what was real and what wasn't. But the truth is that you could just watch Shamrock and Suzuki and you could see that Shamrock did the job for Suzuki. Yeah. It's just, it's just really one of those things where it's like, okay, we want to be legit, but at the same time, we need to make money. Yeah. And, real fighting, you can't predict your outcomes. So therefore, you have to, in turn, have fake fights to create more rematches, to create more money. And you need to create stars as well. So Funaki would often do jobs really quickly for some fighters because if you beat Funaki, you become a big star. But the reason we can move on now to UFC, because UFC started around the same time as Pancras took off. And the first UFC event, people thought it was fake, the first UFC event. To be fair, the way it looked, especially with some of the competitors there, it did look fake. Like a lot of the not stars, a lot of the guys I'd seen, in my head I'm thinking, this does not look like someone that is a legitimate fighter in any type of martial art. I can't name any names, but you'd see someone, a lot of mismatches, you'd see someone where they're probably out of shape, they're bigger, and you're thinking this person is not someone that fights. Oh, it's just someone that's in a gi and they're aware they've got a black belt, but then when you actually see them go toe to toe, it's like, yo, I shouldn't have judged this whatsoever. The interesting fact about UFC 1 was that out of the 8 fighters that were featured on that card, 5 of them had done pro wrestling. Yeah. 5 of them. That's over half. They'd all done fake fights. in Japan for rings and pancras.
Yeah.
Ken Shamrock was the biggest name.
Was Dan Severn?
He wasn't in UFC 1. He started at UFC 4. We don't even need to go on to Severin yet and those guys, but like the early UFC 1 had 5 pro wrestlers on it, which is mad when you think about it. Patrick Smith was a wrestler. Gerard Godot was a pro wrestler. Shamrock was a pro wrestler. It's like, and also, and you mentioned the fact, UFC 1 was while it was real, it was built for Royce Gracie to win.
Yeah.
He fought a guy who had a boxing glove on, which is ridiculous. But if you look at the way the tournament is laid out, it is laid out for him to win because his brother Orion promoted the show. But him and Shamrock were the early stars of the first UFC. But then more pro wrestlers came in. Dan Severn came in, who was trained by Al Snow for his MMA fights. He was trained in pro wrestling by Al Snow, and Al Snow also trained him in the early UFCs as well. He used to corner him, which is insane.
I did not know that whatsoever.
He did. Dan Severn did UFC 5 and 6 as the NWA World Champion. He walks out with the NWA Championships, the same belt that Tyrus has nowadays. Used to be featured on NWA.
Tyrus.
He used to be featured on UFC pay-per-views, bizarrely. He had all those titles, but if you going back to Japan, so you've got pro wrestlers running MMA organizations that are purported to be real fights.
Yeah.
Okay. The biggest MMA organizations at the time are run by pro wrestlers. All right. Now you've also got the UWFI, which is run by Nobuhiko Takada, who was promoting himself as Antonio Inoki, who would fight some other martial arts, and he'd beat them in work fights. So he had a rep as well for being a tough guy, even though the fights weren't real. Yeah. There's a very famous fight with Trevor Berbick that he has. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but you need to watch it because Trevor Berbick, he double crosses Trevor Berbick because Berbick agreed to do a work fight, and at the last minute, he wouldn't do a job for Takada.
Yeah.
They said they'd go to a draw, and if you watch that fight, Takada kicks the shit out of Berbick. Like, he beats him up for real, and Berbick jumps out of the ring running away because he didn't know what was going on, because he thought that we were going to go to a draw. Right? But we walk into Pride now, the first Pride show, and Pride, which at the time was the biggest MMA organization that ever existed, was started as 50% pro wrestling and 50% MMA. If you look at the first Pride show, half of those fights were fake, involving pro wrestlers, some rings, and Pancras and UWFI. Yeah. And the reason why the Pride organization actually started was because Nobuhiko Takada had challenged Rickson Gracie to a worked fight. And Rickson Gracie wouldn't do fake fighting. Yeah. He refused to do it. And Rickson Gracie at the time was the baddest dude on the planet, people thought. Like, people would legit think he'd beat Mike Tyson in these scenarios or whatever. And Takada would challenge him publicly to fights. And Rickson Gracie would never respond to him because he's not doing fake fights. And they sent a pro wrestler to LA, Yoji Anjo, they sent him to the Gracie Dojo. You heard the story?
Yeah, I heard the story.
They sent him to the Gracie Dojo on behalf of Takada, and Rickson beat him up badly. If you ever see these pictures of Yoji Anjo's face, he got destroyed. And there was so much money on the line with this fight. Takada agreed to do a real fight. And if you watch Pride 1 and you see that main event of Pride 1, Nobuhiko Takada is terrified of Rickson Gracie. He is terrified, and Rickson takes him down. He runs away from Rickson throughout the whole fight, pretty much. There's a few takedowns, but it was a terrible fight. Yeah. But Rickson won. But that's how the Pride legacy started. And if you look at the way Pride continued, with Antonio Inoki being a massive influence on the organization, with the amount of pro wrestlers that he put into Pride to have real fights.
That's what we go into Inokiism.
That's what we go into Inokiism. So, would you want to start with Inokiism?
I mean, from what I know Inokiism more so started with a match with Hashimoto and Ogawa. They were, I can't remember what promotion it was.
New Japan.
Might have been New Japan.
1997.
Yeah.
Tokyo Dome, I think.
That became a very, very, very stiff match, and I'm sure that inspired Inoki to now have this obsession with plucking MMA fighters and putting them in wrestling, and then plucking wrestlers and putting them in MMA just to see how legit they are. And I think it's fair to say that he more so nearly destroyed New Japan because of it.
He nearly did. They were on life support.
Yeah, he'd pick a wrestler that he'd want to push. He'd now put them in an MMA fight. They would end up losing. Then he just wallows the push at this point. What are there any like key wrestlers that you could say benefited from Enokism? First person I can think of is Fujita.
Yes, Fujita worked for UWFI for years and years and years, and he had a rep because he was a really good amateur wrestler. He went to the Olympics, Fujita, as an amateur wrestler, freestyle wrestler, and he was in New Japan for a little bit, and Inoki said take a year off and train, and he went to Pride, and he actually was quite successful in Pride. He beat a few big names in Pride. The problem was though is that he was still working for New Japan, and he was their world champion, and he got destroyed by Mirko Krokop, and he got beaten by Bob Sapp, and he got beaten by Vanderlei Silva, and he got beaten by Fedor. He, you know, as a pro wrestling world champion, you cannot go out there. You're supposed to be, you know,
You're meant to be the toughest.
You're meant to be the toughest, and you go out there and you get destroyed so easily. It just wasn't good. But he wasn't the only one. I mean, Yoshihiro Akiyama was a star of New Japan, and he actually benefited because he had the fight with Don Frye. He benefited from,
And that was a good fight.
it was an amazing
It
fight.
was a very, very good fight.
If anyone is,
I love Akiyama, man.
oh, he's great.
It pains my heart speaking sometimes, but
Yeah, I know.
even like, because I was like, this is just off a tangent. I was watching a lot of his Noah matches. I was watching his first, it was Kobashi's first defense against him. God, what a match, man.
That match.
What a match.
It's not only that. I mean, what he had a rep for being super tough, and the Don Frye fight proved
it.
that he can take a punch. So that became his gimmick in pro wrestling. He would take shots. So those fights, I mean, the pro wrestling matches with Kenta Kobashi, Nakamura, he got his ass kicked. But they were great matches, though. They were so great. And it got to a point with him, though, where when he went to Pride, he'd lose.
Yeah.
He'd get beaten. And then he'd go and be IWGP World Champion. And it gets to, with the thing with Japanese fans is that, yeah, we know you're tough, but we don't need to see you doing MMA.
Yeah.
And MMA got so big in Japan at the time, there was no need to watch pro wrestling, to be fair, because
Especially at a point where it's exposing these pro wrestlers that you're meant to be fans of.
yeah, you're exposing the pro wrestlers, and then they had the MMA guys coming over to New Japan and having shitty matches.
Yeah.
Bob Sapp was the world champion.
Speak about his rise, if you can.
But Bob Sapp was in WCW. He was at the power plant for ages, and he made a couple of appearances on WCW. Super charismatic guy, really big guy, and he went to Japan, and he trained to fight. For some, I don't actually know why he trained to fight. He had no experience prior.
Yeah.
But he was big, and he was muscular, and he was like 370 pounds, and they loved him in Japan. He had a match.
It was crazy.
Yeah, he had a match with Nogueira at Pride Shockwave 2002, and he powerbombed Nogueira in that match, and he nearly beat Nogueira, but he got caught in an armbar.
Yeah.
And at that moment, he became a superstar.
Especially for a black guy as well in Japan.
But he was huge. He had records, and he had adverts. He had Bob Sapp stores. He was at that time the biggest pro wrestling star, and also he was working K1.
Yeah.
And he beat Ernesto Hus twice. Ernesto Hus was, at the time, he was considered the greatest kickboxer of all time. Mr. Perfect, Ernesto Hus. Bob Sapp beat him twice. It's out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And he became a star. The problem with Bob was that he took too much on. He was having fights, and he was having pro wrestling matches, and he was giving himself a couple of weeks at a time to do both. And, you know, he just got tired, and he kept getting beat. And he got to a point where he was just getting beaten all the time, you know. But he was a really big deal for a couple of years. Like some of the biggest matches in Japanese wrestling history involved Bob Sapp in terms of viewership. But Nakamura was another one that benefited because he actually won a few MMA fights. He was one of Inoki's later projects who came along later. And Inoki was like, take a year off to train. We'll get you an MMA. He lost the first two.
Yeah.
But then he came back and he won a couple. Shibata was another one who Inoki focused on.
Shibata I watched a few of Shibata's MMA matches and I was just like, I see your vision.
You see the vision.
Just run and tumble, just do what you need to do, just try and get over and done with, but at the same time, there's only so many times you can do that in your fights where people are going to realise your game plans.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the whole thing with Pride and the pro wrestling aspect, and going back to Pride again, was that you had pro wrestlers on the Pride shows, and Takada was working the Pride shows, and some of the fights weren't real. And once again, you've got Inoki running the organization, presenting real fights, and how many of these fights were actually legit is a question in a lot of people's heads. Like there was a fight with Mark Coleman and Takada at Pride 5 that was clearly worked. It really was. And it's always been one of those questions as to how many of these fights were actually real. Most of them were, I believe. But it's always a question just because who was involved in the amount of pro wrestlers involved in these shows. But yeah, the influence on MMA, of pro wrestling influence on MMA is huge. It really is huge. And without pro wrestling, MMA in its current form would not exist just because of the legacy of Karl Gotch and the names that I mentioned previously.
Even down to things like pay-per-views. I feel like nowadays as well, like a lot of the MMA stars, we talk about the Conor McGregor's, big personalities, and that's not something that was just there when you look at the first UFC shows or even a lot of the early MMA stuff. That's down to pro wrestling at the end of the day.
Well, if you look at UFC's rise, it started from Ultimate Fighter, which was on after Raw. Monday nights at 10 o'clock, UFC Ultimate Fighter came on, and the reason why it was even on was because they asked Vince McMahon if they could have it on. Vince McMahon had it in his contract that any type of pro wrestling / sports entertainment, he'd have to authorize, and he agreed to have it on. And, I don't know what would happen if UFC had followed another show, but the wrestling audience stayed and they watched Ultimate Fighter, and they created stars out of Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner and those guys. I mean, it's kind of similar to what Turner are doing now with Slap. They're putting Slap on right after Dynamite. I mean, it's not working. But a lot of the UFC audience that they had in 2005 were pro wrestling fans. And it's the way that they promote the fights. It's the big characters. It's the promos. It's the traditional pro wrestling booking of, wins and losses matter, which is something that at the time pro wrestling veered away from. And also the promos. The promos in UFC were better than the guys that were doing them on Raw at that time. Those big characters were Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell and Brock Lesnar when he came over eventually. Brock Lesnar was an amazing promo in UFC. He was absolutely fantastic. He believed in it. And he was another big one that came over, and, his rise in MMA was based on his pro wrestling ability and his name. He was a massive draw for UFC. He was the biggest draw they had until Ronda came along.
So my final question for you before we wrap up this conversation in terms of pro wrestling influence at MMA. If there is one MMA star that you could turn into a pro wrestling star, let's say main event New Japan, they've got all the tools, they've got the Yuji Nagatas to train them, they've got the Kijimoto's to train them. Which MMA star would you have? I've got an answer. I feel like we might have the same answer.
What's your answer?
Kevin Randleman.
Oh, you mean from then? I thought you meant current day.
Nah, anytime.
Oh man, I love Kevin Randleman. He was so good. He did pro wrestling.
But if I could lock him down for a year, get him trained up, make him work proper matches, I'm putting him half an hour with Okada or Kenny Omega. I think he's incredible.
His vertical leap was so impressive. Kevin Randleman, he had all the tools, but he wanted to do pro wrestling. He legit wanted to do pro wrestling. The problem was at that time there was no spot for him in pro wrestling. New Japan was dead. Like, he was doing bookings with Heroes, one of the Inoki groups. WWE would not want Kevin Randleman at that time because they were burnt by the other MMA fighters that they had at that time.
So I know he done a few Hustle shows as well.
He done Hustle.
Let's not start on that one.
Yeah, Takada's Hustle. He did Hustle.
Let's not start on that one.
But I mean, he
Takada was entertaining in Hustle though.
He was great.
He was entertaining in Hustle.
You look at the MMA fighters from that time period, and you go Mark Coleman. He did pro wrestling. Kevin Randleman did pro wrestling. Bas Rutten did pro wrestling in New Japan as well. Don Fry. I think I remember speaking to you a while ago. I remember saying, like, out of all the UFC heavyweight champions, I think like 14 of them had done pro wrestling. It might have even been more. But all those guys have done pro wrestling. But Kevin Randleman, he would have been, if he was given the right training, if Kevin Randleman came along now, he would be. He had so much charisma. He was so talented. He had a great look, and his physique was just off the chart. You know, and he was a super tough guy as well. I still remember when he beat Krokop in Pride, and Moro's call was just legendary. You know, I got a soft spot for Kevin Randleman. Conor is one that I think of now.
Conor would be good.
He'll do WWE at one point. At some point in the future, he'll definitely do WWE.
Hopefully, that'll be good to see.
I don't know if it'll work, but I'd want to see it.
He might go to AEW, who knows?
Nah.
Oh, I've enjoyed this one. This was, like we said, how pro wrestling inspired MMA. I've been Delboy.
Knowledge.
And this is Wrestling for Idiots.